Welcome to Chapter 14, Sharur's Death. 12 years after Gilgamesh. Sharur falls defending partnership from external threat. Could have prioritized enhanced district, militarily logical. Chose baseline protection instead, partnership maintaining. Enhanced warrior who learned equity from founder. Second generation leader proving transfer possible beyond charismatic founder. Dies defending what he believed. This is the story of how second founders' deaths prove frameworks must replace personal authority, and how succession accelerates when biology determines lifespan. Let's begin. Chapter 14, Sharur's Death. The Decline. Sharur's home, Uruk, baseline quarter dawn, 6 months before death. Sharur woke to pain that baseline bodies developed in their sixth decade, joints stiffening, muscles weakening, organs slowly failing through cellular damage that baseline physiology couldn't repair. 63 years old. His grandfather had died at 58. His father is 61. He was approaching the limit of baseline longevity, his body reminding him daily that time was ending. He looked across the sleeping mat at Esani, 64 years old, showing the same decline as his own. Gray hair, wrinkled skin, movements careful where once they'd been fluid. They were aging together, dying together, experiencing mortality's march that enhanced humans wouldn't face for another century. Partnership Council session scheduled for noon. Enkidu would be there, 64 years old by calendar, physically 40 through enhanced cellular repair. Ishara, age 87, looking 50. Durga, age 93, is still vital. Enhanced peers who debated the Consolidation Amendment with him 2 years ago, still governing while he approached death. The constitutional vote had defeated segregation 92 to 73. Partnership survived. Sharur had helped save it. And now he'd die while enhanced peers who'd wanted segregation continued governing for another century, waiting for him and other baseline opponents to age out naturally so they could try consolidation again without resistance from founders who'd fought it. That was biological inequality embedded in governance. Baseline voices were temporary, enhanced voices were persistent. Constitutional protections he'd fought for would be interpreted and applied by beings who'd outlive him by a century, shaped by priorities he couldn't influence from the grave. He'd spent 2 years since the consolidation vote building institutional protections designed to survive his death, training next-generation baseline leaders, documenting governance philosophies, and creating frameworks that ensured baseline representation renewed continuously as individuals cycled through mortality. Working on legacy because time was ending. Partnership Council Chamber. Noon session. Sharur walked to the council chamber with careful movements that betrayed declining physical capacity. Baseline representatives noticed, many were his age, experiencing the same decline, recognizing their collective mortality approaching, while enhanced peers remained vital. Enkidu was already seated when Sharur arrived, processing the council agenda at enhanced speed, finishing the briefing materials before baseline representatives started, a biological advantage manifesting in every interaction, every meeting, every governance function. The session focused on infrastructure investment, baseline districts needing upgrades that enhanced districts had received decades earlier, when Zephyrus had built optimally for enhanced capabilities while building simply for baseline needs. Copper mining family legacy, from 2830 to 2820 BCE crisis. Durga presented economic data using mining statistics Valkyne had preserved from the copper crisis 8 years prior, 6th-generation mining family on Cyprus, Danal through Zimri. 14,000 miners died over 2 centuries extracting copper, enriching trade networks. Zimri's son, 7th generation, transitioned to iron mining after the depletion of copper. Different material, different techniques, different dangers. Family tradition continuing but adapting to resource changes that partnership governance hadn't prevented. Sharur absorbed information, recognition that the mining family Enkidu had cited during the consolidation debate as evidence for capability-based segregation was now being used to justify infrastructure investment in baseline districts where miners' descendants lived. 7 generations of one family mining copper then iron, Sharur said, voice carrying the wariness that 63 years of arguing for baseline dignity produced. Enhanced leadership knew about copper depletion 10 years before baseline populations recognized the shortage. Partnership governance prevented enhanced stockpiling, barely. Now we're discussing infrastructure investment for baseline mining communities affected by resource transition that enhanced coordination predicted early. He met Enkidu's eyes. Your grandfather survived the collapse through partnership. You almost dismantled the partnership through a constitutional amendment. I'll die soon. You'll govern another century. That mining family will continue through another 3 or 4 generations during your remaining tenure. Partnership's challenge is ensuring their voices matter despite biological disadvantage, making their individual voices temporary while your voice persists across their generational succession. The chamber was quiet, baseline representatives recognizing the mortality timeline Sharur was naming explicitly, enhanced representatives uncomfortable with the advantage being cited as a governance problem rather than a natural fact requiring no acknowledgement. 2 months later, agriculture allocation debate. The sessions were becoming harder. Not intellectually, Sharur's mind remained sharp, processing arguments with clarity that experience sharpened rather than age dulling. Physically, each attendance cost more than the previous one, the body demanding increasingly greater effort to accomplish what younger physiology performed without conscious consideration. 63 years, 2 months. Family history suggested a maximum of 65, probably less, given the current decline trajectory. Sharur tracked his deterioration with the same methodical precision that enhanced populations apply to everything. Morning pain inventory expanded weekly, mobility reduced incrementally, and exhaustion accumulated despite rest periods that increased proportionally. Today's walk to the council chamber took 50 minutes. 2 months ago, 40 minutes had been challenging. Progression was measurable, predictable, and mathematically specific. Asani walked beside him, 64 years old, his wife of 40 years, showing identical aging patterns through shared baseline genetics, experiencing parallel decline. She'd refused to stay home, insisted on accompanying despite Sharur's protests that walking doubled had become more complicated than walking alone, out of concern that compounding physical challenge with emotional burden. "I'm dying with you," she'd said simply. "Not watching you die without me. We walk together." So they walked together, slowly, carefully, 2 baseline humans approaching mortality that enhanced neighbors would delay by 7 decades through biology, making partnerships equality theoretical while inequality remained visceral at every step, demonstrating disadvantage that constitutional protections acknowledged without eliminating. The council session addressed the agricultural allocation for the upcoming planting season. Enhanced coordination optimized crop selection based on climate modeling that predicted drought patterns 3 years ahead by processing meteorological data that baseline observation would recognize only when rain failed, manifesting predictions that enhanced foresight had identified years prior, enabling preparation that information advantage created selectively. Enkidu presented an allocation proposal, 64 years old, appearing 44 physically, standing with vigor that made Sharur's seated exhaustion appear more pronounced through contrast, amplified by the chamber's positioning and the enhanced representatives standing easily. In contrast, baseline representatives sat conserving energy for standing when voting required physical demonstration of positions, their declining bodies struggled to maintain without visible effort. 3-year drought cycle approaching, Enkidu explained, displaying probability models that enhanced processing comprehended instantly. At the same time, baseline representatives studied data sequentially, requiring time that enhanced cognition didn't need to reach identical conclusions through different cognitive paths. Recommend shifting allocation toward drought-resistant varieties, sorghum over wheat, millet over barley. Reduced yield during normal rainfall years but sustained production during drought years, preventing famine that reactive planning produces when recognition arrives too late for adaptation, preventing catastrophe. Sharur listened from a seated position, conserving energy through stillness that standing would deplete through effort that younger bodies dismissed as negligible but that aging physiology experienced as demanding, through cardiovascular stress that limited capacity and couldn't sustain indefinitely without rest that standing prevented from providing adequately. The proposal was sound. Enhanced foresight enabling proactive adaptation rather than reactive crisis management. But implementation would disproportionately affect baseline farmers. Switching crop varieties would require knowledge transfer, technique modification, and equipment adaptation that baseline agricultural communities would bear as costs. At the same time, enhanced coordination would capture benefits by optimizing allocation, serving populations unequally, despite serving both populations through planning that biological advantage enabled selectively. Mira presented baseline concerns. 51 years old, an infrastructure engineer who'd challenged the Consolidation Amendment 4 years prior, now an agriculture coordinator, inheriting the complexity that partnership governance had created by attempting to achieve equity across populations experiencing biology differently. Drought preparation is necessary, Mira acknowledged, displaying baseline farming communities that enhanced allocation would affect directly through requiring adaptation that biology made easier for enhanced coordination than baseline implementation. Question is transition support. Whether enhanced foresight advantage translates to enhanced preparation advantage requires partnership providing resources enabling baseline populations adapting to recommendations that enhanced processing produced through biological capability that baseline cognition didn't match, regardless of partnership claiming equality mattered more than capability differences biology created permanently. Sharur wanted to stand for this argument. Wanted physical presence reinforcing the position that seated exhaustion undermined through a visible demonstration that a declining body couldn't maintain the vigor that the political position deserved, projecting. Wanted movement, emphasizing that stillness was prevented through the gesture limitation imposed to conserve energy. He stood carefully, joints protesting, cardiovascular system responding with an elevated heart rate that standing produced, as diminished capacity met the demand that younger bodies satisfied easily. Breathing became labored immediately, not from the duration of standing but from the initiation of standing, the body struggling with the transition that the representatives performed unconsciously. At the same time, baseline aging is made conscious through effort required rather than automatic through capability maintained. The chamber noticed. Enhanced representatives watched uncomfortably. Baseline representatives watched with recognition. Hybrid representatives watched a pattern emerge. Their intermediate aging would eventually occur when the hybrid lifespans 118 years approached, requiring succession that would allow peers to outlive them simply by persisting beyond hybrid mortality, arriving later than baseline but earlier than enhanced timelines permitted. Enhanced foresight created this proposal, Sharur said, voice carrying despite breath demanding careful management between phrases. 3 years warning that baseline populations won't receive until drought arrives, manifesting predictions, enhanced processing identified early. That information advantage creates responsibility, enhanced foresight obligates enhanced support for baseline adaptation to enhanced recommendations produced through capabilities baseline populations lacked. Partnership means enhanced advantages don't translate to enhanced benefits without baseline accommodation receiving equivalent support, enabling both populations to implement predictions that enhanced biology produced through advantage partnership acknowledges without celebrating as justification for enhanced prosperity exceeding baseline welfare when crisis validates foresight that biology provided selectively. He paused, breathing heavily, speech duration exceeding capacity that age had reduced incrementally but certainly toward mortality that mathematical probability calculated approaching with precision that actuarial tables provided uncomfortably. Enkidu's expression showed conflict, respect for a dying opponent, arguing through physical decline that words would seem redundant, emphasizing discomfort with biological advantage being weaponized politically, with the opponent using their own mortality as evidence that enhanced longevity created governance inequality that constitutional frameworks attempted to address inadequately. I support transition assistance, Enkidu said carefully, tone suggesting yielding the respect required rather than agreement with the conviction produced. Enhanced foresight does create responsibility when baseline populations face adapting to recommendations generated by enhanced processing. Partnership serves both populations through ensuring advantages don't compound into exploitation that biology enables, but that justice shouldn't accept regardless of capability differences, creating temptation toward optimization serving enhanced populations disproportionately. Other enhanced representatives, following Enkidu's lead, supported transition assistance not because they believed baseline populations deserved equivalent support, but because they recognized that a dying baseline leader had made denying assistance require ignoring the mortality that biological advantage demonstrated inescapably through Sharur's standing with difficulty. In contrast, enhanced peers stood effortlessly despite chronological ages exceeding his by decades, while cellular repair enabled them to persist beyond baseline limitations. The vote approved the allocation with transition support, 119 to 31, enhanced foresight combined with baseline accommodation. Partnership functioning through conscious choice that each session required renewing, rather than assuming automatic continuation, which biological inequality made structurally challenging when advantages persisted. At the same time, opposition cycled through mortality, requiring continuous replacement. Sharur sat immediately after voting concluded, body demanding rest that standing had depleted through effort. Younger physiology wouldn't notice the accumulation, but the aging baseline was experienced as exhaustion requiring recovery time, which enhanced representatives didn't need between activities, their vigor handled continuously without conscious energy management. That baseline aging was imposed necessarily. Asani remained beside him, waiting while he recovered enough strength to attempt a return walk that 50 minutes would require, covering the distance enhanced representatives would manage in 15 through pace that baseline aging couldn't match without risking falls that broken bones could produce when balance deteriorated. Bone density declined with aging, a partnership acknowledged but not prevented biologically. 2 sessions this month. 2 more next month, probably. Each harder than the previous. Each demonstrates a biological inequality that constitutional equality claimed to have transcended. Still, that physical reality, made undeniable by observation, required no argument when presence sufficed to prove the political advantage that longevity created, simply by outlasting the opposition's mortality imposed selectively. Partnership survived another session. The question was how many more sessions Sharur's body would permit before succession became necessary rather than optional, before baseline representation required a new voice because the old voice had ended, through biology that enhanced peers would outlive by decades, through simply persisting beyond mortality that calendar measurement approach with mathematical certainty regardless of political positions requiring continuation that biology wouldn't provide indefinitely. The Old Kingdom memory. Private reflection, evening. Sharur sat in his study reviewing historical documents. Order had preserved, Methuselah providing access to records that baseline populations didn't usually see, recognition that Sharur's time was limited, and Order's purpose was preserving truth for future judgment. Old Kingdom collapse documentation, 2200 to 2180 BCE, 638 years ago. Kenti, baseline farmer near Memphis. 4 children. Lost 2 to famine during consecutive Nile flood failures. Enhanced neighbors survived through stockpiles accumulated during abundance, while extraction had concentrated in enhanced hands. Enhanced coordination enabled resource extraction efficiency during plenty. Enhanced foresight enabled stockpiling for scarcity. Baseline populations experienced benefits in efficiency during abundance and costs in scarcity during famine. Partnership governance existed but couldn't prevent biological advantages translating to survival advantages when crisis arrived. Sharur knew this pattern firsthand, had experienced it during the copper crisis, when enhanced families secured copper 2 weeks before baseline families learned of the shortage. Pattern repeating across centuries, biological advantages creating information advantages creating resource advantages creating survival advantages that partnership's political equality couldn't eliminate. He thought about his grandfather, born in 2888 BCE, who survived the famine that killed his sister because the family had connections to enhanced networks that provided early warning. Grandfather had told stories about watching enhanced neighbors remain well-fed. In contrast, baseline neighbors starved, about the guilt of survival through privileged access rather than equal distribution, about the recognition that partnership protections were theoretical during abundance but became crucial during scarcity. My grandfather survived through proximity to enhanced networks, Sharur said aloud to the empty study, voice carrying recognition that his family's survival across generations had depended on enhanced cooperation that partnership formalized. I exist because enhanced humans chose sharing information rather than monopolizing advantage. That's partnership working, not perfectly, not equally, but sufficiently to enable baseline survival when natural development might have caused extinction. He wrote in a journal, being prepared for his successor. Baseline leadership faces a mortality timeline, enhanced leadership doesn't experience it. I'll die. My successor will die within a generation. Enhanced peers will govern across our successive generations. Partnership requires ensuring baseline voices persist institutionally despite individual voices ending biologically. Challenges in eliminating biological advantage can't be done. Challenges building structures, preventing biological advantage, converting political advantage that outlasts individual baseline leaders' abilities to resist through personal authority. The Iron Age philosophy. Visit from Hattusili. Hattusili arrived at Sharur's home carrying a gift, an iron blade of exceptional quality, craftsmanship compensating for the material's inferiority to bronze, thereby enhancing the population's monopoly through accumulated wealth. 44 years old now, Baseline Smith, who developed an Iron Age dignity philosophy, arguing baseline populations could find pride in inferior material through craftsmanship excellence. He'd spoken at the Consolidation Amendment debate 2 years prior, 5 reasons for baseline pride despite material disadvantage. Brought something for you, Hattusili said, presenting a blade with craftsman's pride. My best work. Iron that performs nearly as well as bronze through technique rather than material superiority. Wanted you to have it before. He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Both knew before meant before death approached Sharur, faster than the Baseline Smith, who had 20 years remaining, while the Partnership Council leader had months. Sharur accepted the blade, feeling the weight that was greater than bronze, iron's density, requiring more effort to wield effectively. 5 reasons for taking pride in inferior material, he quoted Hattusili's testimony. Independence, sophistication, democratization, innovation, community. Still true 2 years after you spoke them? More true, Hattusili replied, sitting across from the dying leader with the living Smith's respect for mortality approaching. Bronze monopoly by enhanced populations is complete now. Every baseline, Smith transitioned to iron because they can't afford bronze anymore. We've spent 2 years developing techniques that make iron perform almost as well as bronze. Not quite, metallurgy can't overcome material facts, but close enough that baseline populations defend themselves effectively despite economic disadvantage forcing material inferiority. That's dignity, achieving competence despite disadvantage rather than requiring equality to justify worth. We're inferior materially. We're excellent technically. Both true. Partnership works when both acknowledge rather than pretend material equality exists when demonstrably it doesn't. 5 reasons revisited. Sharur asked, teach me again. 5 reasons for baseline pride. Want them fresh in mind when I die. Hattusili obliged, craftsman teaching leader philosophy emerging from workshop rather than council chamber. First, iron is abundant. We're not dependent on enhanced trade networks for access to materials. That's strategic independence through material self-sufficiency. Second, iron techniques are sophisticated. Carburizing, quenching, and tempering require skill, which bronze doesn't need. We're excellent at complex techniques but adequate at simple ones. That's craftsmanship pride. Third, iron democratizes warfare. The bronze monopoly created a military hierarchy. Iron availability enables baseline defense. We can protect ourselves despite economic disadvantage. That's tactical equality through technological accessibility. Fourth, iron forces innovation. Working with inferior material requires developing superior techniques. We're innovating constantly while bronze smiths repeat traditional methods. That's a creative advantage compensating for a material disadvantage. Fifth, iron builds community. Shared struggle with difficult material creates solidarity. We help each other because we have to. Enhanced cooperation is optional, biological advantages make independence viable. Baseline cooperation is necessary, biological disadvantages make solidarity essential. That's social strength through collective necessity. Sharur absorbed philosophy, recognition that Hattusili's 5 reasons applied beyond metallurgy to baseline existence within partnership generally, independence through adaptation, excellence through effort, accessibility through material democracy, innovation through constraint, and community through shared struggle. Those 5 reasons are baseline dignity philosophy, Sharur said. Not just iron metallurgy. Everything we do within partnerships that enhance populations is made easier. We matter because we matter, not because we match their capabilities, but because consciousness has worth regardless of biological containers' limitations. Hattusili nodded. That's what I'll say at your funeral. Your words, given back to you now while you can hear them. You taught us that biological inferiority doesn't mean moral inferiority. Enhanced humans live longer, process faster, and coordinate better. And we matter anyway. That's the partnership's promise, equal dignity despite biological inequality. You defended that promise through constitutional fights I can't fully comprehend because I'm a smith, not a politician. But I understand dignity. And you embodied it. The medical reality. Talia's visit. Talia materialized in Sharur's home with a medical assessment that baseline physiology made necessary, an immortal healer checking on a dying baseline leader, guilt over creating biological inequality driving personal care for those her enhancement had most disadvantaged. Your body is failing systematically, she said, as enhanced medical diagnostics providing a precision baseline medicine were lacking. Kidney function is declining 40% below baseline normal. Heart showing irregular rhythms. The liver processes toxins inadequately. The brain is experiencing reduced oxygen perfusion. Cellular repair systems are exhausted. 6 months remaining. Maybe less. Sharur had known this. Body's signals were unambiguous even without immortal diagnostic precision. But hearing the timeline stated explicitly made mortality concrete rather than abstract. Can you extend it? He asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it spoken. No. I've worked with 47 baseline subjects over the past decade, researching life extension. Enhanced cellular repair can't be retrofitted into baseline biology, enhancement must be present from conception, or genetic modification fails catastrophically. Your cells are baseline. They're dying according to the baseline timeline. I can make you comfortable. Can't make you live longer. She sat across from him, an immortal who'd lived 55,000 years, facing a baseline human who'd lived 63 years, a creator of enhancement facing its consequences personally rather than abstractly. I created a biological hierarchy through enhancement, saving humanity from extinction, Talia said, voice carrying guilt earned through millennia of witnessing good intentions produce unintended hierarchies. You're dying at 63 because I didn't give your ancestors enhancement. Enhanced peers who debated consolidation with you will govern another century because I gave their ancestors enhancement. That inequality is my responsibility regardless of intentions. You saved my species, Sharur replied, generosity toward an immortal healer surprising even himself. Baseline humans would be extinct without intervention. I exist because you intervened. I died early because the intervention created a biological hierarchy. Both true. You're not responsible for choosing between extinction and inequality, those were the only options available. You're only responsible for how you manage the inequality enhancement created. And you're doing that. Baseline healthcare priority, medical equity investments, personal care for dying baseline leaders like me. Talia absorbed this, baseline forgiveness for the hierarchy's creator. Thank you. But responsibility remains. I could have designed the enhancement differently. It could have made it transferable to baseline adults rather than requiring genetic modification from conception. Choose an expedient solution during a crisis rather than an optimal solution for long-term equity. That's my failure haunting me through your death and every baseline death that comes early because enhancement wasn't shared. Mortality statistics, from Chapter 10 Research. Baseline humans, 59 years average lifespan. Enhanced humans, 187 years average lifespan. Hybrids, 118 years average lifespan. You're 63, 4 years above baseline average. You've lived well within biological constraints. But enhanced peers your age are 40 years from middle age. That's unfair. That's unchangeable. That's reality partnership accommodates rather than solves. Sharur asked a question he'd wondered about for decades. Do you regret creating enhancement? No. Humanity survives because of enhancement. But I regret not anticipating the full consequences of the enhancement and creating a biological hierarchy without mechanisms to manage it equitably. Believing the intervention could be medically neutral when it's obviously politically loaded. Learning across 55,000 years that good intentions don't prevent bad outcomes, they just make you responsible for outcomes you didn't intend. She stood to leave, an immortal healer having done what she could for the dying baseline leader who represented the consequences she spent eternity attempting to mitigate. 6 months, she repeated. I'll visit weekly. Make you comfortable. Document your final decline for medical research that might help future baseline populations. Honor your death by learning from it. That's all I can offer. The family visits. Multi-generational gathering. Sharur's family gathered, knowing time was limited, daughters, sons, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. 4 generations of baseline humans visiting a dying patriarch who'd helped found a partnership ensuring their survival despite a biological disadvantage, making their survival uncertain. His eldest daughter, Mara, 38, was already showing age-related decline that enhanced what women her age didn't experience. Her husband, son-in-law Sharur, had known for 20 years. Their children, grandchildren, and Sharur had watched grow. Their children's children, great-grandchildren born just years ago, who'd never know their great-grandfather as a vital man, only as a dying elder. 4 generations in a room simultaneously because baseline mortality compressed generations, humans reproduced young knowing time was limited, families expanded rapidly because individuals ended quickly. Enhanced families didn't gather 4 generations simultaneously, generational spacing was wider because longevity made early reproduction unnecessary, and families expanded slowly because individuals persisted for centuries. Multi-generational mining family parallel. Remember the copper mining family from Cyprus? Sharur asked Mara. Danel through Zimri, 6 generations across 2 centuries. Now, 7th generation mining iron. I thought about them often during consolidation debates. Their family persisted through resource transitions, technological changes, and economic disruptions. Partnership enabled that persistence despite baseline disadvantage, making their individual lives shorter than enhanced lives. Mara nodded. You told us that story when we were children. 6 generations of mining copper until copper ran out, then adapting to iron. You said it showed baseline resilience. We persist through generations rather than individuals, families continuing even when members die. Exactly, Sharur confirmed. Enhanced humans persist as individuals across baseline generations. We persist as families, lineages, and communities. Different temporal strategies for survival. Neither superior, both necessary. Partnership works when both strategies are valued rather than enhanced individual persistence treated as superior to baseline collective persistence. He looked at 4 generations gathered, visual proof of baseline generational strategy, rapid succession enabling family persistence despite individual brevity. I'll die, he told them, making explicit what everyone knew. You'll continue. Your children will continue. Your grandchildren will continue. Your great-grandchildren will continue. Baseline dignity isn't measured by individual lifespan, it's measured by collective persistence across generations. Enhanced humans persist individually. We persist collectively. Both are valid survival strategies within a partnership. His youngest great-granddaughter, age 4, asked with child's directness, "Why do we die faster?" Because our bodies are different, Sharur explained simply. Enhanced bodies repair themselves better. Baseline bodies wear out faster. That's not fair. But fairness isn't about having the same biology, it's about mattering equally despite biological differences. You matter just as much as enhanced children, even though you'll live fewer years. Quality matters more than duration. The child absorbed this with a 4-year-old's incomplete comprehension, understanding that great-grandfather was dying without fully grasping that she'd die early too by enhanced standards, that her short life would matter anyway, and that worth transcended years. The succession planning. Private meeting with Aga. Aga visited privately, 73 years old, a baseline scholar who developed a baseline dignity philosophy decades earlier, now himself approaching death that his peers wouldn't face for another century. 2 baseline founders nearing simultaneous ends, recognizing that their deaths would eliminate 2 voices that had fought enhanced consolidation since the partnership's founding. Enkidu would outlive both by 80 years. Ishara by 100. Partnership would lose baseline institutional memory, while enhanced institutional memory would persist. We're dying together, Aga said, not as a complaint but as an observation of a biological timeline neither could change. You are from natural cellular failure. I have cancer that baseline medicine can't cure effectively. Enhanced peers we've debated with for 50 years will govern another century after we're gone. Sharur acknowledged, that's governance mortality inequality. We fought consolidation personally. Our successors will fight institutional consolidation. The question is whether the institutions we build survive without the personal authority that sustained them during the founding generation. Baseline dignity philosophy succession. Aga pulled out a manuscript, a complete philosophy developed across decades, now being passed to the next generation before death eliminates its creator. Baseline dignity, 5 principles. 1. Consciousness worth. We matter because we're conscious, not because we match enhanced capabilities. 2. Generational persistence. We survive through families across generations rather than as individuals across centuries. 3. Collective strength. Baseline cooperation is necessary, enhanced cooperation is optional, necessity creates stronger communities. 4. Adaptive innovation. Disadvantage forces creativity. We innovate constantly while enhancing optimization incrementally. 5. Temporal equality. Shorter life doesn't mean lesser life. Worth is measured by significance, not duration. He handed the manuscript to Sharur. This is what I'm leaving behind. You helped develop these principles through 50 years of constitutional fights defending baseline populations against enhanced consolidation. Now we're both dying. Principles must survive us. Next generation needs this philosophy already articulated, so they're not starting from nothing when enhanced populations try consolidation again. Sharur read principles that recognized his own arguments embedded in Aga's scholarly framework, constitutional debates condensed into a philosophical foundation. Political fights transformed into ethical axioms. Who takes our places? Sharur asked practically. And see for me, 49 years old, another decade of active leadership before decline begins. Fought the Consolidation Amendment 2 years ago. Understands dignity philosophy personally from raising granddaughter who learned at 9 that she'd die while enhanced peers were barely entering middle age. He'll carry philosophy forward after I'm gone. For you. Aga paused, calculating succession politics. Mira is the strongest candidate, 53 years old, baseline engineer who maintains Zephyrus's infrastructure, understands both technical and political dimensions. Respects enhanced capabilities while refusing to accept that those capabilities justify hierarchy. She'll fight consolidation after you die. Sharur agreed. Mira, then. I'll recommend her officially. The Partnership Council will decide, but the dying founder's recommendation carries weight. Enhanced populations will know we're passing leadership intentionally rather than abandoning partnership through death. Both men sat in silence, 2 baseline founders approaching simultaneous death, planning succession, ensuring institutional memory survived despite biological memory ending. We built something, Aga said finally. Partnership isn't perfect. Doesn't eliminate biological inequality. But it prevents inequality from becoming tyranny. That's worth dying for. Worth having lived for. Sharur agreed. The final decline. 3 months later. Sharur's decline accelerated. Talia's 6-month estimate proved accurate as kidney failure, heart irregularities, liver inadequacy, and oxygen deprivation compounded into a cascade that baseline medicine couldn't arrest. Enkidu visited privately, the grandson of the founder, visiting the baseline founder who'd fought alongside his grandfather 50 years ago, a biological advantage, visiting a dying elder and a vital younger man who'd outlived the elder by a century. My grandfather died believing partnership could work if both populations chose it consciously, Enkidu said, sitting beside Sharur's bed with the awkwardness that enhanced vigor experienced confronting baseline mortality. You proved him right. Fought consolidation for 50 years. Defeated my constitutional amendment 2 years ago and maintained a partnership through personal authority that ends with your death. Question I'm asking, can the partnership survive without you? Without Aga? Without baseline founders who remember why partnership matters, because you lived through alternatives? Sharur considered with clarity that approaching death sometimes produced biological failure, sharpening mental focus on what mattered most. Partnership survives when each generation chooses it consciously rather than assuming it sustains itself automatically. You'll be tempted to try consolidation again after I die, I know that. Enhanced advantages make hierarchy easier than equality. Biological pressure toward consolidation persists regardless of constitutional constraints. But here's what you need to understand, partnership isn't just about preventing enhanced domination. It's about enabling both populations to thrive despite biological inequality. Enhanced humans thrive through individual persistence, institutional knowledge, and accumulated experience across centuries. Baseline humans thrive through generational succession, adaptive innovation, and collective solidarity across shorter lifetimes. Partnership works when both strategies are valued. fails when the enhanced individual strategy is treated as superior to the baseline collective strategy. That's what my death should teach you. I die, but baseline populations persist. My voice ends, but the baseline voice continues through succession. Value that succession rather than dismissing it as inconvenient mortality cycling. And key to absorb this, enhanced cognition processing wisdom from a dying baseline leader who'd fought enhanced consolidation that enhanced cognition made logically defensible. I hear you. But 73 representatives voted for my amendment. Support for consolidation grows incrementally with each crisis. Eventually, a two-thirds majority will support the formalization of the biological hierarchy constitutionally. What happens then? Then the partnership failed, Sharur replied honestly. Or partnership evolved into something neither of us would recognize as a partnership. That's a possibility I'm accepting by dying, that my generation's choices don't bind your generation's choices, that populations can modify institutions we built we won't live to influence, that partnership survival depends on continuous conscious choice rather than the founding generation's authority extending from the grave. I can't stop you from trying consolidation after I'm dead. Can only hope that institutions we built, philosophy we developed, framework we established, convince your generation that partnership serves both populations better than hierarchy would serve enhanced populations alone. He coughed, body's failure interrupting speech, baseline mortality making itself felt viscerally. You'll govern another century after I'm buried. Use that century wisely. Remember that I mattered despite dying early. Remember that baseline populations matter, even when dying generationally. Remember that partnership was a choice we made consciously, believing it served everyone better than alternatives. If you abandon partnership after we're dead, make that choice consciously too. Don't pretend biology forced you, don't claim inability to sustain equality. If you choose hierarchy, own that choice. Enkidu left shortly after, the enhanced grandson of the founder having received dying wisdom from the baseline founder who'd fought the enhanced grandson's consolidation attempt, carrying the burden of the time ahead, a century of governance during which baseline opponents would die while enhanced advocates persisted. Time would reveal whether he'd honor Sharur's wisdom or pursue consolidation that biology made easier than equality. The death. Sharur's home, final day. Sharur died at 63 with family gathered, 4 generations of baseline humans surrounding the dying patriarch who'd helped ensure their existence despite biological disadvantage, making their existence uncertain. Asani held his hand, 67 years old, outliving his husband by minutes rather than years, a partnership of 50 years ending with biological simultaneity that enhanced partnerships wouldn't have experienced. Talia was present medically, documenting death with clinical precision while feeling personal grief over the biological inequality her enhancement had created. Another baseline human died early because she'd created a hierarchy to save humanity from extinction. The death was peaceful, organ failure rather than a catastrophic event, the body simply stopping when cellular systems couldn't sustain function any longer. Baseline mortality arrives according to the baseline timeline. The enhancement is defined as creating a superior alternative. Sharur's final words were to Mira, the successor he'd recommended. Don't let them forget. Baseline populations matter. Short lives matter. Mortality doesn't diminish worth. Fight consolidation. Maintain partnership. Choose consciously. Make it matter. Then death, consciousness ends as brain oxygen deprivation exceeds the critical threshold, baseline biology reaching its natural limit. Partnership Council leader dead at 63, while enhanced peers remained vital for another century. The funeral. Partnership gathering, 3 days later. 150 beings gathered at a burial ground outside Uruk's walls, where baseline humans had interred their dead for 40 generations. In contrast, enhanced humans had buried none because none had died yet through longevity. That partnership's founding predated making enhanced deaths a theoretical possibility rather than an experienced reality that baseline populations knew intimately through generational succession, requiring continuous replacement. The contrast was visual, undeniable, heartbreaking. Enhanced families. Enkidu stood with 4 generations present, his children, 30s chronologically, appearing 20s, grandchildren, teenagers, great-grandchildren, children, and great-great-grandchildren, infants. 5 generations alive simultaneously through enhanced longevity, enabling family structures that baseline biology couldn't sustain through mortality, limiting generational overlap to 3, usually 2, practically. Ishara attended with a similar family constellation, 89 years old, appearing 54, surrounded by descendants spanning 80 years of births that her continued vitality enabled witnessing continuously rather than dying before later generations arrived, a baseline grandparents rarely saw through mortality arriving too early for meeting great-grandchildren, which enhanced longevity permitted knowing across decades of sustained life. Durga brought 5 generations, 95 years old, appearing to be no more than 67, with great-great-great-grandchildren playing nearby. At the same time, their ancient ancestor watched with an energy that suggested decades remaining rather than recognizing mortality approaching, despite a century of living, providing experience that physical presentation didn't suggest, given the vigor maintained robustly. Baseline families. Sharur's family showed a different structure, 2 generations maximum, 3 rarely. His children attended, 40s chronologically, appearing 40s physically through honest baseline aging, grandchildren, teenagers showing youth, baseline biology couldn't extend beyond 20s before aging began to visibly, and 1 great-grandchild, an infant that Sharur had met twice before, decline prevented travel that visiting required managing. Other baseline families demonstrated an identical pattern, limited generational depth, aging visible across decades rather than concealed through centuries, mortality approaching rather than delayed indefinitely, family structures shaped by a biological timeline that 65 years maximum constrained rather than 187 enhanced longevity permitted, extending through cellular advantages that baseline genetics lacked completely. Hybrid families. Saduri stood between both extremes, 48 years old appearing 40 through intermediate aging, 3 generations present, her children in 20s, grandchildren infant/toddler, herself middle-aged by baseline standards but young by enhanced comparison, family structure showing biological middle position that made hybrids embodiment of partnerships challenge accommodating populations aging differently despite constitutional equality claiming age didn't determine worth regardless of longevity affecting political influence through simply persisting beyond opposition's mortality. The positioning showed hierarchy wordlessly, enhanced families large, multi-generational, physically robust, baseline families small, limited generational depth, showing age visibly, hybrid families intermediate, biological bridges demonstrating a spectrum that a constitutional binary couldn't accommodate without erasing 11% of beings whose existence complicated the efficiency that classification enabled. The speeches. Hadasili spoke first, baseline Smith, 44 years old, an ironworker who'd given Sharur a blade embodying 5 reasons for baseline pride that Sharur had articulated as philosophy justifying existence despite biological disadvantage, making baseline populations seem inferior when capability comparison occurred. Sharur taught that we matter because we're conscious, not because we match enhanced capabilities, Hadasili said, voice carrying across the gathering. At the same time, the wind moved through the trees surrounding the burial ground, creating a sound that enhanced hearing process distinctly. While baseline hearing was experienced as an ambient background, their biological processing didn't differentiate as completely. He said mortality doesn't diminish worth. That shorter life doesn't mean a lesser life. That baseline cooperation is necessary while enhanced cooperation is optional, necessity creating stronger communities through solidarity that biological disadvantage requires, while enhanced advantage makes independence viable. He said we persist through families across generations rather than as individuals across centuries. That baseline continuity requires institutional succession, while enhanced continuity requires individual persistence. Both approaches create legitimacy, ours through continuous renewal that requires conscious choice, theirs through sustained experience that enables accumulated wisdom. He said we innovate through constraint. That working with inferior material requires developing superior techniques. That disadvantage forces creativity, while the advantage permits optimization of existing methods. The baseline populations are created constantly, while the enhanced populations are perfected incrementally. He said baseline dignity exists independently of enhanced comparison. That our worth is intrinsic rather than relative. That consciousness has value regardless of the biological container's limitations or advantages. That being human transcends being enhanced or baseline, humanity preceding modification, consciousness preceding capability, existence preceding efficiency. Those 5 principles sustained him through 63 years of fighting consolidation attempts that biological pressure created continuously. Sustained baseline populations through recognizing that partnership valued persons before functions, beings before capabilities, consciousness before optimization, that efficiency demanded accepting hierarchy that capability differences enabled naturally. He died believing that a partnership could survive if we choose it consciously each generation. Died hoping institutions would outlast founders through baseline succession, providing continuous renewal that mortality imposed necessarily, while enhanced persistence provided continuous experience that longevity enabled selectively. We honor him by continuing that choice. By valuing baseline succession as the partnership's strength rather than lamenting mortality as the partnership's weakness. By recognizing that conscious renewal every generation proves commitment more thoroughly than passive continuation across centuries, it demonstrates that choosing repeatedly shows conviction, while persisting once shows merely longevity, enabling persistence rather than philosophy requiring maintenance. Several baseline families wept, recognizing that Sharur's death was a pattern they'd all experience, that baseline representation would cycle through succession continuously. At the same time, enhanced representatives persisted across their generational replacement. That partnership required valuing temporary voices equally with persistent voices, despite biology making equality structurally challenging, as mortality imposed replacement was avoided naturally. Enkidu's eulogy. Enkidu stood next, 64 years old, appearing 44, vigorous while baseline peers declined, living. In contrast, baseline opponents died, persisting while baseline resistance cycled through mortality, requiring continuous replacement that enhanced continuity didn't face, simply outliving opposition that biology eliminated selectively, without populations requiring effort beyond continuing existence that longevity permitted maintaining effortlessly. Sharur opposed every consolidation attempt I proposed across 30 years, Enkidu said, voice carrying weight earned through decades of political combat that mutual respect had shaped rather than simple opposition defining. Constitutional amendment 4 years ago, he organized resistance that defeated Proposal 92 to 73. Infrastructure prioritization debates, he argued baseline needs deserved resources despite competing demands from enhanced optimization. Agricultural allocation planning, he demanded transition support, ensuring baseline populations received assistance adapting to enhanced foresight recommendations, as their biology hadn't enabled them to produce independently. He was right opposing me. Not because capability-based acknowledgement was wrong philosophically, biological inequality is real, advantages exist, pretending equality when inequality is manifest creates tension that honesty could relieve. But because formalizing hierarchy creates a slippery slope from acknowledgement to exploitation, incremental consolidation occurs when initial moderation transforms into absolute subordination across generations that founders don't witness, completing the process because founders die before consequences manifest fully. He taught me that being right technically doesn't justify dismissing opposition philosophically. That capability advantages being real doesn't mean the capability hierarchy is just. That biological inequality exists doesn't mean political hierarchy is inevitable. That enhanced population surviving longer doesn't make enhanced governance wiser, just more persistent, across opposition's mortality, that we outlive simply through the continued existence that longevity permits sustaining beyond baseline limitations. I'll probably govern for another 80 years. We'll face temptation to consolidate when baseline opponents die, requiring replacement with less experienced leaders who haven't fought me for decades, earning respect that combat produces. We'll remember Sharur's final words as he was dying, if you choose hierarchy after I'm dead, own that choice consciously, don't pretend biology forced you when partnership philosophy required resisting pressure that biology created continuously. I'm accepting that challenge. Promising a dying opponent that his death won't become an opportunity for consolidation that his life prevented through resistance, I respect him despite disagreeing philosophically. Partnership survives through enhanced populations choosing equity consciously rather than accepting efficiency naturally, choosing despite biology making choice harder than yielding, despite longevity enabling outlasting opposition rather than convincing opposition that partnership serves both populations despite serving differently through biology requiring accommodation that political equality demanded providing actively. Enhanced representatives listened uncomfortably, and Kidu's promised constraining future attempts at consolidation that Sharur's death might otherwise enable, by removing experienced opposition that newer baseline leaders couldn't match immediately, lacking decades of combat that respect had required earning gradually. Regional Representative, Kasset. Kasset spoke, representing peripheral baseline communities, 58 years old, in Cyprus mining regions where Sharur's philosophy had prevented enhanced coordination from extracting resources without ensuring baseline communities received the equivalent benefits the partnership claimed to provide, despite geography making enforcement challenging when distance-separated populations experiencing inequality differently. Sharur remembered peripheral communities when Uruk debates focused on urban populations, Kasset said. Remembered that consolidation would affect regional baseline populations differently than central baseline populations, that enhanced coordination reaches everywhere, while baseline autonomy depends on distance, which enhanced advantages overcome through information networks that geography doesn't constrain, limiting enhanced reach significantly. He defended baseline autonomy as a universal principle rather than as one that protected only populations close enough to central governance for effective oversight. Defended the right to refuse enhanced optimization when baseline communities preferred local control despite efficiency losses that enhanced coordination could have prevented through centralization, serving enhanced interests primarily. A partnership exists in the Uruk chamber where we're burying him. Partnership also exists in Cyprus mines, Indus farmlands, and Egyptian villages, where baseline populations maintain communities that could be optimized through enhanced coordination. Still, baseline autonomy is protected through partnership governance, preventing efficient extraction that would serve enhanced prosperity without ensuring baseline communities receive equivalent benefits that justice demands, despite efficiency suggesting otherwise. Sharur's death removes a voice defending peripheral baseline interests that urban debates sometimes ignore by focusing on central populations where enhanced baseline interaction occurs daily, making inequality visible and compelling action. Peripheral populations experience inequality differently, through extraction relationships that enhanced trade networks create rather than through daily proximity that urban positioning produces. We honor him by remembering that partnership serves all baseline populations, central and peripheral, urban and rural, visible and distant, through ensuring enhanced advantages don't compound into extraction relationships that geography enables when oversight focuses centrally. At the same time, exploitation occurs peripherally beyond effective monitoring, which prevents functioning adequately. Hybrid Perspective, Saduri. Saduri spoke final, 48 years old, hybrid daughter of an enhanced mother and a baseline father, biological bridge experiencing mortality gaps on both sides, aging faster than enhanced relatives but slower than baseline family members who had already died by 60, the maximum lifespan that hybrid genetics exceeded substantially. Sharur died at 63, Saduri said. My baseline father died at 61. My enhanced mother will probably live to 187. I'll live to 118, dying after baseline family but before enhanced family, experiencing mortality gap from middle position that makes loss perpetual rather than singular. Sharur taught that mortality doesn't diminish worth. That baseline dignity exists independently of lifespan comparison. That consciousness matters, regardless of how long it persists before biology ends existence, and that partnership is valued equally despite longevity differing dramatically. I'm a hybrid experiencing that teaching personally, watching baseline family die early, watching enhanced family persist indefinitely, knowing my death will arrive between both extremes, creating perpetual mourning rather than singular loss because biological middle position means grieving baseline deaths while knowing enhanced deaths won't occur during my lifetime, making grief continuous rather than concluded. Sharur showed that partnership values persons before longevity. That baseline leaders matter, even if they die early. That succession creates continuity rather than requiring individual persistence. That institutional memory preserves baseline voices after baseline individuals die through documentation, ensuring future generations hear arguments that mortality ended. Still, that recording maintains across enhanced lifespans, while baseline succession couldn't match it by simply outliving the biology-limited baseline longevity. Hybrids embody that lesson physically. We're a transitional generation between baseline mortality and enhanced longevity, experiencing both extremes through family structure that biology created through partnership, enabling reproduction across the genetic divide that speciation would eventually close completely if genetic integration didn't proceed faster than divergence that partnership attempted to prevent through equity that biology undermined continuously. Sharur's death reminds us that partnership survives through valuing temporary voices equally with persistent voices. Through recognizing that baseline succession is a strength rather than a weakness. Through honoring mortality as human experience rather than lamenting longevity as an enhanced advantage that biology provided unequally, but that justice couldn't accept as determining worth regardless of capability differences affecting political influence through simply outlasting opposition's biology that mortality eliminated selectively. Aga's final words. Aga spoke last, 73 years old, dying himself, Baseline founder eulogizing Baseline founder with recognition that both deaths were eliminating baseline institutional memory simultaneously. Sharur and I are both dying. Cancer will kill me within months. Partnership loses two baseline founders simultaneously. Enhanced peers will govern without us. That's biological inequality manifesting politically. Baseline voices end while enhanced voices persist. The question is whether institutional baseline voice persists despite individual baseline voices ending biologically. Sharur built structures enabling that persistence: succession planning, philosophy articulation, constitutional frameworks, and institutional memory preservation. Baseline voice continues through Mira, NC, and others we're leaving behind. But persistence isn't guaranteed. Requires a conscious choice each generation. Enhanced populations will be tempted toward consolidation that biology makes easier than equality. Baseline populations will be inclined to accept that subordination seems inevitable, given biological disadvantage. Partnership survives only if both populations resist temptations despite biology making resistance difficult. Sharur died believing the partnership could survive. I'll die believing the same thing. Whether we're right, the next generation will determine. We've given them tools. They must choose whether to use tools that maintain partnership or abandon tools that accept hierarchy. That's succession, passing tools, not determining outcomes, and trusting the future without controlling it. Dying knowing we did what we could while alive, accepting that death eliminates our influence over what comes after. Sharur would approve of that honesty. He lived honestly. Died honestly. Leaves honest legacy rather than comfortable fiction. The burial. Baseline cemetery, sunset. Sharur's body was lowered into the earth, a baseline burial practice that enhanced populations hadn't needed using yet through absence of enhanced deaths that partnership's founding predated, making enhanced mortality a theoretical possibility rather than a practical reality that baseline populations knew intimately through continuous experience with loss that generational succession imposed regularly. Asani stood at the grave edge, 64 years old, wife of 40 years, knowing her death would follow within months, probably through a parallel decline that shared baseline genetics created through aging together toward mortality that biology imposed identically on both, despite a partnership claiming equality that transcended biology's limitations, which constitutional protections acknowledged without eliminating practically. 4 generations of Sharur's descendants watched burial, children remembering father, grandchildren remembering grandfather, great-grandchild too young remembering but present, documenting that 4 generations had overlapped briefly before first generation died, requiring second generation becoming eldest through succession that mortality imposed necessarily on baseline populations while enhanced families maintained 5 generations simultaneously through longevity that baseline biology couldn't sustain regardless of partnership claiming equality mattered more than capability differences biology created permanently. The grave closed. Earth covered body. Mortality completed the process that aging had begun 63 years prior, when birth initiated a timeline that baseline genetics constrained, limiting it through cardiovascular disease, organ failure, and cellular damage that enhanced repair, preventing or delaying it significantly, creating a longevity advantage that political equality acknowledged without eliminating biologically. The partnership council leader was dead at 63. At the same time, enhanced peers remained vital for decades simply by continuing the existence that biology permitted beyond the baseline limitations mortality selectively imposed on populations. The Partnership Council claimed to serve equally despite serving differently through biology, requiring accommodation that political frameworks attempted to provide inadequately. The gathering after. Families gathered at community hall after burial, enhanced families large and robust, baseline families small and aging, hybrid families intermediate and transitional, three populations attempting unity despite biology creating difference that observation made undeniable regardless of constitutional equality claiming difference didn't determine worth that partnership attempted protecting through equity that biology undermined continuously through advantages persisting beyond constraints that institutions imposed theoretically but couldn't enforce practically. The gathering showed partnerships challenge wordlessly, enhanced vigor and baseline decline occupying same space, enhanced longevity and baseline mortality requiring accommodation, enhanced persistence and baseline succession needing recognition that temporary voices mattered equally with persistent voices despite biology making equality structurally challenging through mortality replacing baseline leaders continuously while enhanced leaders continued governing across baseline generational succession that longevity enabled outlasting simply through persisting beyond opposition. Biology that age eliminated selectively. The partnership had survived the death of the founder 34 years earlier and the second founding leader's death today. Surviving through conscious choice, each generation renewed rather than achieving a stable equilibrium that biology enabled, sustaining automatically without requiring continuous effort, preventing collapse into a hierarchy that biological pressure created naturally through advantages persisting beyond constraints that conscious resistance maintained exhaustively. The question remained whether the partnership survived long enough for genetic integration, eliminating inequality, before political exhaustion accepted hierarchy that biology enabled naturally when resistance became unsustainable through baseline populations cycling through mortality faster than enhanced populations persisted through longevity, creating an accumulating advantage that political equality acknowledged without eliminating constitutionally. Sharur was buried. Partnership continued. Baseline representation cycled through succession. Enhanced representation persisted through longevity. Hybrid populations watched, documenting patterns of their intermediate biology embodied physically. In contrast, both parent populations experienced political through partnership, attempting equity that biology made perpetually challenging by creating inequality that conscious choice could constrain but never eliminate. At the same time, genetic differences persisted, determining the capability selectively. The funeral ended. Beings departed. Grave remained. Partnership continued imperfectly, necessarily, consciously chosen against biological pressure, making hierarchy easier than equality, which required effort to maintain across generations, choosing repeatedly rather than accepting once through passive continuation, which was enabled naturally by longevity. The Aftermath Assessment. Immortal Council, that evening. The 9 immortals gathered, assessing Sharur's death's implications for partnership survival, mortality gap made visible, baseline institutional memory depleted, enhanced governance advantages increased. Nix presented probability recalculation. Partnership survival, post-Sharur death. Next 50 years, 68%, down from 71% post-consolidation vote. Next 100 years, 54%, down from 58%. Until genetic integration, 8 generations, 39%, down from 43%. Sharur's death reduces partnership survival probability 4% because baseline institutional memory is depleted while enhanced institutional memory persists. Aga will die within months, 2 baseline founders eliminated simultaneously while enhanced peers remain vital. Pattern creates governance imbalance favoring enhanced populations not through enhanced malice but through enhanced longevity, making enhanced voices persist while baseline voices cycle through mortality. Talia's guilt was visible. I created this. The biological hierarchy causes baseline leaders to die while enhanced leaders persist. Sharur defended the partnership for 50 years and died at 63. Enkidu attacked the partnership 2 years ago and will govern for another 80 years. That's unfair. That's my responsibility because enhancement design creates timeline inequality that the partnership can't fix. Erebus added vindication, warned 5,000 years ago that intervention would create unfixable problems. The biological mortality gap is such a problem. Can't extend baseline lifespans. Can't shorten enhanced lifespans. Can only accept permanent inequality and attempt to manage it equitably. Sharur's death proves the challenge. Baseline leadership is temporary, enhanced leadership is persistent. Partnership requires compensating for that inequality continuously across generations. Exhausting. Maybe unsustainable. Sophia reflected on teaching's limits, taught baseline and enhanced populations equally. Both populations learn critical thinking. But enhanced populations will remember my teaching across centuries, while baseline populations will cycle through it generation by generation. Institutional knowledge accumulation favors longevity. That's educational inequality I didn't predict when teaching began. Kronos acknowledged systemic reality. Sharur died. Mira succeeded. She'll die in 20 years. Her successor will die 20 years after that. During those 40 years, Enkidu will govern continuously, institutional memory accumulating while baseline memory cycles through succession. That's an efficiency argument for enhanced governance. Continuity produces better outcomes than succession. Sharur convinced me that efficiency isn't everything, that justice requires accepting suboptimal outcomes serving equity. But his death tests that conviction. Easier to accept suboptimality when the founder advocating for it is alive. Harder when the founder dies, and suboptimality remains without personal authority enforcing it. Prometheus considered the technology dimension, taught iron to baseline populations during the copper crisis. Iron democratized material access. But iron weapons are spreading now, a technology cascade I enabled, producing military consequences that Sharur won't live to see. Baseline leaders like Sharur resisted consolidation, believing that partnership would manage technology equitably. Their deaths eliminate voices advocating for equity while technology advantages persist, favoring enhanced coordination. The assessment concluded, Sharur's death weakened the partnership by eliminating baseline institutional memory while enhanced memory persisted, by depleting baseline leadership while enhanced leadership continued, and by reducing survival probability through biological inequality that the partnership acknowledged but couldn't eliminate. Partnership survived the founder's death. But survival margins narrowed again. Pattern emerging, each crisis, each death, each challenge reduced partnership survival probability incrementally. Eventually, probability would fall below the threshold at which collapse became likely rather than unlikely. Race continued between genetic integration, eliminating hierarchy naturally, and political consolidation, formalizing hierarchy constitutionally. Sharur's death didn't determine the race outcome. Just made the outcome less specific. 3 weeks later, second founder death. Aga died 3 weeks after Sharur, 71 years old, with Parkinson's-like degeneration that baseline neurology experienced when cellular damage accumulated beyond repair capacity, which enhanced genetics prevented through advantages that baseline biology lacked entirely, making neurological decline a baseline reality rather than a baseline possibility that prevention could avoid reliably. 2 baseline founders are dying within a month. Both are 70+ years old. Both key consolidation opponents. Both were leaving younger successors who'd inherited the resistance philosophy without experiencing the pre-partnership era that the founders remembered directly, having lived before the partnership existed, making opposition informed by personal memory rather than institutional philosophy that successors learned secondhand through teaching that experience had repeatedly validated. The double funeral occurred at same burial ground where Sharur's grave remained fresh, earth barely settled, flowers still present, grief still raw from first founder's death, making second founder's death feel like pattern completing rather than separate tragedy requiring individual mourning. That cumulative loss had exhausted baseline populations experiencing mortality's rhythm that enhanced populations observed without experiencing personally through absence of enhanced deaths that partnership's founding predated, making enhanced mortality theoretical possibility rather than practical reality that baseline populations knew intimately through continuous succession requiring perpetual replacement. The gathering smaller. 100 beings attended, fewer than Sharur's funeral 3 weeks prior, not from lesser respect but from grief exhaustion that baseline populations experienced through continuous loss that generational succession imposed regularly, making each death feel both singular and repetitive through a pattern that mortality created systematically when baseline lifespans limited overlap to decades rather than centuries that enhanced longevity permitted sustaining indefinitely. Enhanced representatives paid respects, uncomfortable with the advantage being repeatedly demonstrated as baseline founders died. In contrast, enhanced founders persisted, vitally aware that biological inequality was manifest through observation requiring no argument, when presence at a second baseline funeral within the month proved the longevity advantage that constitutional equality acknowledged without eliminating structurally. Myra's eulogy. Myra spoke, representing baseline leadership succession, 53 years old now, inheriting resistance from Sharur, who'd inherited it from Gilgamesh 34 years prior, creating a chain of baseline opposition that mortality necessitated and required replacement. At the same time, philosophy persisted through institutional memory, preserved across enhanced lifespans that baseline succession couldn't match biologically. Aga and Sharur died within 3 weeks, Myra said, voice carrying exhaustion that continuous loss produced when baseline populations experience mortality's rhythm that enhanced populations observed without participating through absence of enhanced deaths, making grief one-sided rather than mutual despite partnership claiming both populations shared burdens equally regardless of biology determining who died when requiring replacement versus who persisted indefinitely enabling continuity. Both were Gilgamesh's friends. Both stood at the founder's deathbed 34 years ago. Both spent 3 decades fighting consolidation attempts that biological pressure created continuously, through enhanced advantages that tempted a hierarchical structure that partnership principles required resisting exhaustively. Both are dead now, within a month of each other. Pattern is undeniable, baseline founders die, enhanced founders persist, baseline succession continues. In contrast, enhanced continuity maintains the baseline leadership of mortality cycles while longevity sustains enhanced leadership, creating an accumulating advantage that political equality acknowledges without eliminating constitutionally. I'm inheriting resistance from Sharur. NC is inheriting Aga's scholarship. We're younger, less experienced, haven't fought consolidation for decades, and haven't earned respect through sustained opposition that experience enables, maintaining it across political crises, testing commitment repeatedly. We'll serve maybe 15 years before aging requires our succession. 20 years maximum before cardiovascular disease, organ failure, cancer, stroke, or cellular damage produces mortality that baseline biology experiences universally, regardless of lifestyle choices, that prevention attempts enable delaying but never avoiding altogether when genetics limit longevity to 65 years, average 70, maximum rarely 80, exceptionally. During our 15 to 20-year tenure, Enkidu will govern continuously. Ishara will persist robustly. Durga will remain vital. Enhanced continuity outlasting baseline generational succession that mortality imposes selectively on populations, partnership claims serve equally despite serving differently through biology, requiring accommodation that political frameworks attempted to provide inadequately when inequality persisted despite constitutional protections claiming equality transcended biological differences, creating advantages systematically. That's the partnership's challenge that Aga and Sharur understood intimately as mortality approached. At the same time, enhanced peers remain vital, building institutions that prevent biological advantage from converting into political advantage that outlasts individual baseline leaders who die and require replacement. In contrast, enhanced leaders persist across baseline generational succession that longevity enables continuing indefinitely without requiring conscious renewal that mortality forces baseline populations choosing continuously. Enhanced recognition, Enkidu. Enkidu spoke, acknowledging the pattern that the double funeral made undeniable, 64 years old, appearing 44, standing vigorous. At the same time, baseline peers declined, living while baseline founders died, persisting. In contrast, baseline resistance cycled through mortality, requiring continuous replacement, which enhanced continuity, whereas avoiding it simply by outlasting the opposition that biology eliminated selectively. 2 baseline founders dead within 3 weeks, Enkidu said, tone carrying recognition that advantage was manifest through observation, making denial impossible when evidence accumulated proving inequality that words had made theoretical. Sharur at 63. Aga at 71. Both key consolidation opponents. Both died while I remain vital with 80 years remaining, probably through longevity that they lacked completely through baseline biology, limiting lifespan to a maximum they both exceeded only marginally before mortality arrived inevitably. This creates temptation. Baseline opposition dies. Enhanced support persists. Consolidation attempts that Sharur and Aga defeated might succeed when made against Mira and Insi, who haven't fought me for decades, earning respect that sustained combat produces through mutual recognition that worthy opponents deserve acknowledgement despite philosophical disagreement. I'm recognizing that temptation explicitly, naming it publicly and consciously resisting it, rather than yielding to it naturally when opportunity presents, through baseline succession removing experienced opposition that newer leaders can't match immediately, lacking the decades of combat that respect required earning gradually. Sharur asked me to make my own choices consciously. To recognize if I choose hierarchy, choose it deliberately rather than pretending biology forced me when philosophy required resisting the pressure that advantages created continuously. I'm extending that commitment to honor Aga's memory alongside Sharur's, promising that a double baseline founder death won't become an opportunity for consolidation that their lives prevented through resistance. I respect the differing perspectives on whether resistance served both populations optimally. Partnership survives as populations choose equity consciously rather than accept efficiency naturally. Through enhanced leaders recognizing that outlasting opposition doesn't validate positions, just demonstrates longevity advantage that biology provided unequally, but that justice couldn't accept as justifying hierarchy regardless of capability differences affecting political influence through simply persisting beyond opposition's mortality that biology imposed selectively on populations, partnership claims served equally. The succession burden. Mira and Insi stood together at burial ground edge, both 50-plus years old, both inheriting resistance philosophy from founders who died leaving institutional memory that documentation preserved but personal authority that mortality had eliminated through baseline biology limiting individual persistence to decades that enhanced longevity exceeded by century through advantages making succession necessary rather than optional for baseline populations maintaining continuity that enhanced populations achieved through individual persistence rather than institutional replacement. They'd probably serve 15 years maximum. During that tenure, Enkidu would govern, Ishara would coordinate, Durga would persist, enhancing continuity across the baseline generational succession imposed by mortality. At the same time, longevity avoided creating a structural advantage that political equality acknowledged without eliminating through constitutional protections, claiming equality mattered despite biology determining who cycled through replacement versus who continued governing across the opposition's mortality that biology selectively eliminated. Baseline community response. Baseline families gathered, recognizing a pattern that double funerals demonstrated inescapably, founders dying, enhanced persistence, mortality creating succession. At the same time, longevity maintained continuity, biological inequality manifests through observation, requiring no argument when a second burial within the month proved the advantage that constitutional equality claimed transcended. Still, that physical reality was made undeniable by the cumulative evidence repetition unavoidably provided. Children attended both funerals, too young to understand philosophy but old enough to observe the pattern that enhanced families brought 5 generations. In contrast, baseline families brought 2, which enhanced the grandparents' appearance as middle-aged. In contrast, baseline grandparents appeared elderly, and the enhanced vigor persisted. In contrast, baseline decline progressed, which biology created inequality, partnership acknowledged without eliminating constitutionally, despite claiming equality transcended biological differences, determining capability selectively. Pattern was established. The baseline founders would die, necessitating succession. Enhanced founders would persist, enabling continuity. Partnership would survive through baseline populations consciously choosing each generation, while enhanced populations chose once, with longevity permitting commitment to persist across baseline generational replacement that mortality necessarily imposed. Aga was buried beside Sharur. 2 graves are fresh. 2 founders are dead within a month. Partnership survives through conscious choice, renewed rather than through a stable equilibrium achieved automatically, when biology makes equality challenging by creating advantages that constitutional frameworks constrain without eliminating. 34 years after Gilgamesh's death. No baseline founders remained who'd known each other personally in the pre-partnership era. Next generation inherited philosophy through teaching rather than experiencing directly through memory that founders had possessed uniquely, making their deaths eliminate eyewitnesses to partnership's necessity that pre-partnership hierarchy had demonstrated, requiring preventing through equity that biology made perpetually challenging to maintain across populations experiencing advantages differently through genetic modifications, creating inequality that partnership attempted constraining through institutions that continuous choice sustained exhaustingly. The double funeral ended. The baseline community mourned. Enhanced community observed. Hybrid community documented. Partnership continued imperfectly, necessarily, consciously chosen against biological pressure, making hierarchy easier than equality, that effort required maintaining when resistance died, requiring replacement. At the same time, support persisted through longevity, enabling consolidation attempts to survive the mortality that biology selectively eliminated in populations, a partnership that claimed to serve equally despite serving differently under biological reality, a reality that political equality acknowledged without eliminating constitutionally. Epilogue: the mortality gap persists. 2 years later, 2816 BCE. Aga died, cancer ending life at 75. Second baseline founder eliminated. NC succeeded, carrying dignity philosophy forward, but a gap was visible, 2 baseline founders dead, 0 enhanced founders dead, biological inequality manifesting through differential mortality. Partnership Council continued, Mira leading the baseline coalition, and Enkidu leading the enhanced coalition, same constitutional debates repeating with different voices, because underlying biological inequality persisted despite individual voices changing. Immortals documented a pattern with clinical precision. Founder deaths, 32 to 34 years post-Gilgamesh. Baseline, Sharur, 63, Aga, 75, both dead. Enhanced, Enkidu, 68, Ishara, 91, Durga, 97, all vital. Hybrids, Saduri, 50, middle-aged. Mortality gap visible. Baseline leadership cycling through succession. Enhanced leadership persists through longevity. Biological inequality that partnership constrained politically, but couldn't eliminate biologically. The question remained, could partnership survive when baseline voices ended while enhanced voices persisted? When baseline institutional memory is depleted while enhanced memory is accumulated? When did biological inequality translate into political inequality despite constitutional frameworks insisting that equality transcended biology? Sharur had died believing the partnership could survive. Time would prove whether belief was wisdom or delusion. Partnership continued. Imperfectly. Necessarily. Tested by the mortality gap that death made visible. The consolidation pressure remained. The biological inequality persisted. A conscious choice was required every generation. Sharur's generation had chosen partnership. The question was whether the next generation would choose similarly despite the biological pressure toward hierarchy that the founder's death had eliminated resistance against. Time would answer. End of chapter 14. Sharur dies defending the partnership. The second founder lost in 12 years. Mira inherits leadership. Baseline woman. 61 years old. Will live 65 maximum. Enhanced predecessors ruled for 90 and 72 years. Baseline mortality means frequent transitions, requiring institutional frameworks to replace personal charisma. Partnership survival, declining further without stabilizing authority. Immortals recognize urgency. Kronos is constantly questioning efficiency. Prometheus regretting gifts' unintended consequences. Constitutional convention approaching necessity. But before frameworks were built, democracy faced a direct challenge. In Chapter 15, Lugal's coup attempt, the enhanced general leads a military takeover. The Bronze Age civil war is threatening. Enhanced warriors versus baseline militia. Constitutional resistance versus military superiority. Partnership survival is tested by force. Join us next time.